Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here. And I want to welcome you to another Liberty at Home series. And today with none other than Christina Dent. And it's going to be an exciting ride because we're talking about a topic that is for some people controversial. Hi, my name is Wolf von Laer and I'm the CEO of Students for Liberty. We are the largest student organization in the world focusing on the ideas of liberty, which also includes having conversations about the effects of the war on drugs. And that is the topic that we are going to talk to Christina today about, because it seems like not only in this country, in the United States, but around the world, it seems that it's pretty much divided. People from the left seem to be like more open to reform, and more conservative people seem all the harmful effects on human beings on drugs and say like, no, this should be forbidden and we should not let that into society because it enables people to harm themselves and their families and their communities. And so it's very much divided along ideological lines. And it's very important to have conversations about this across ideological lines with a spirit of civil discourse. And this is what Christina is working on. She has founded a fantastic organization, got nonprofit status last year. And so she's the founder and president of End It for Good. And it's a specifically conservative nonprofit that invites people to consider alternatives to our criminal justice approach right now. So how many people are we locking up, and is it really necessary? And is this the best approach in order to help people move away from drugs? And so she is asking questions like that and educates millions of people in her home state, Mississippi, but also across the United States. So Christina, welcome so much. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be with you.
Wonderful. And I'm sure we will have like many different questions from the audience regarding this, but let's start and jump in. So let's say you envision you be on an elevator and there is a congresswoman joining you, and she's a conservative congresswoman. So if you had like this elevator ride, 30 seconds, 1 minute time, like what would be the argument for you to convince her that she should rethink her position on the war on drugs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that I personally, once I learned about what was actually happening with the drug war, it came clear to me that actually my pro-life values come to bear on the drug war and ending it. And I think that's the strongest argument for ending the drug war, is that it's actually killing tens of thousands of people every year that don't need to die through crime, through preventable overdose deaths, and it's destroying families. And when you destroy families, you end up destroying communities over time. So as I think about myself as a pro-life person who wants to see strong families and saved lives and strong communities, I think the drug war actually harms us incredibly on all three of those. And I think it's the strongest reason for conservative people to rethink what we're doing.
That's very well put. So what do you think would be, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe most conservatives have a moral problem with drugs. And that's some of the reasons why they are so vehemently against legalizing it or even decriminalizing it. So what do you think is the best arguments for people who are coming from that angle?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit of my story of how I changed my mind, because I think it helps to illustrate that. I was born and raised in Mississippi, which is one of the most conservative and religious states in the United States. I still live here. Went to Christian college. I have a degree in Bible, was raised in a conservative home, Christian home, very happy family and happy childhood. I never used drugs while I was growing up, didn't have friends using drugs, never used drugs in college. Still haven't used illegal drugs. I don't really have any interest in drugs themselves. That's not why I'm interested in this issue. I'm interested in it because I'm interested in people. And I came to see that that's really what we're talking about when my husband and I became foster parents. And through that, I got to know Joanne, who is the mom of one of our foster sons. And I didn't know anything about drugs or addiction when I met her. And I just thought moms who use drugs while they were pregnant must not love their kids. And so I was very suspicious of her. But when I met her for the first time, I pulled into the local child welfare office, and I had her little newborn son with me, who had been brought to our house through foster care. And Joanne meets us in the parking lot, sprinting across it with tears streaming down her face. And I thought, that can't be. This looks like a mom who desperately loves her child, and I don't think that can possibly be. But over the course of getting to know Joanne, I saw that absolutely that was true. She loves her son just as much as I love my 3 little boys. And her drug addiction was not a lack of love. It wasn't a lack of her wanting to be free from it. It was this really complex health crisis that she was in. And I could see immediately putting her in jail is not the right approach to this. No matter what I think about the rightness or wrongness of her drug use, destroying a family because of it is definitely not going to help anything. So I began to see this kind of, there's more than one moral side of this issue. Whether or not you think people should use drugs, maybe that's a moral question. For some people, it's not. For some people, it is. Whether or not you think people should be subjected to incarceration and all of the harms that that brings on a family, that's another moral question. And I think we need to grapple more with the full scope of what we're doing and whether or not it actually helps. So when I met Joanne, it really raised the question in my mind, is there another way to handle drugs and people who use them that would cause less harm? And that was the journey that I took to understand that. That was eventually what I learned on that journey is what changed my mind in favor of legal regulation instead of criminalization for drugs. I didn't want to come to that conclusion. It was extremely difficult, a painful earthquake kind of journey, rethinking something deeply held in your belief system. And yet I also wanted to know, how can we save lives? How can we protect families? How can we protect children? And I came to the conclusion that ending the drug war completely is the best way to do that.
Beautiful. Really, really beautiful. Especially, I want to applaud you for changing your mind, especially something that's so deeply ingrained within you, not only from your values, but also from your religious beliefs, and that you were able to challenge that and see it from a different perspective. That takes a lot of guts, and most people are not willing to do that. So that's fantastic. I want to give you credit for that. Even if people are disagreeing with you right now, they should give you credit for that. And that leads me to another question. So you've been alluding to like some of the arguments that work with more conservatives, but what did you find like is the most compelling case for people to change their minds?
Yes, I think one of the things that's most misunderstood by people who are advocating for ending the drug war is why people who still support it. And I think that takes some listening. So I tried to, as I went through this process of changing my own mind and then looking back on it and saying, how can I help other people kind of take this similar journey who aren't foster parents or who don't have some sort of immediate connection to this and aren't on the journey themselves? To me, there's 3 things that I learned along that path that really are what changed my mind and what are helping other people to change theirs. So I was able to zoom out, and I think we have to do that. We have to encourage people not to look at one specific experience. My experience of Joanne helped me to zoom out and say, what's really happening with this huge issue? We have to zoom out and we have to stop being afraid and get curious. We have been told we should be afraid of drugs, be afraid of drugs, be afraid of drugs. And when you're afraid, you can't rationally think. You can't look into things. You can't be curious. And we really need to be curious. So what I learned is that there's 2 kinds of harm from drugs. One comes from the substances themselves and the potential harm they can do to your body. And the other is harm that comes from criminalizing them. So we've lumped those 2 into one category and we've just called it drugs for decades, but it's not. It's 2 different categories of harm. And the more that I learned, the more I realized the vast majority of harm in our world today that we associate with drugs isn't caused by the drugs themselves. It's caused by drug prohibition. And the way that I came to that conclusion was realizing what happens to the market when you criminalize it, what happens to a substance when you criminalize it, and what happens to a consumer when you criminalize them. So really quickly, I'll lay that out so that people can understand kind of where we're coming at. This is exactly what we tell people at events that we do. Here in Mississippi, we've had about 700 people that have come to our events, and this is what they're hearing. So when you criminalize a market, just like during alcohol prohibition, which people are familiar with, you take a legal substance that's on shelves and you send it into the underground market. It doesn't disappear. It just transfers markets. So now we have all of this crime that's coming not from the drugs, just like it wasn't coming from alcohol during alcohol prohibition. It was coming from the underground market. And you can't settle your disputes in the courts. When you have disputes in an underground market, you settle them on the streets. And you do that through violence and force. And so we are not fighting crime by prohibiting drugs, we're actually funding it. We're giving this massive market to people who are willing to break the law and to be very violent doing it. So we have all of this harm in the market that's driving the majority of all crime in our world today from drug prohibition. Then you have what happens to a substance. So just like during alcohol prohibition, you went from having legal substances on the shelf where you knew the strength of what you were getting. And now you have no idea. Somebody's cooking up something in their bathtub or back in the woods. Same thing is happening today with other drugs. People don't know what they're getting when they buy the little baggie on the street corner. And increasingly, it is contaminated with harder and harder, more potent and more potent substances. Now we have fentanyl on the street. That is a predictable outcome of a criminalized substance. It's going to get more and more potent, just like when people have to smuggle alcohol into sports stadiums. What do they smuggle? They don't smuggle beer. They smuggle hard liquor. Because if you have to smuggle, you need the biggest punch in the smallest package. So today, when we think about the opioid crisis that the US is in, we think about prescription pain pills. That is not what people are dying from. They're dying from street drugs. If you look at the last year that we have data from, the CDC says that 79%, almost 4 out of 5 people who die of an opioid overdose had heroin or fentanyl in their system. People aren't dying from prescription drugs that they're getting from doctors at near the rate that people are dying from drugs they bought on the street, where there's no known potency or purity, and they're dying not because the substance is particularly deadly if it was dosed appropriately, but because you can't dose it appropriately when it's on the street. So that's what happens to a substance. You get all this harm, all of these preventable overdose deaths, and then you have what happens to a consumer. So 10% of Americans now admit to using an illegal drug recently. That's actually from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. That's the US's drug war office, says 10% of Americans admit to using an illegal drug recently. So we have drug use, but when you introduce incarceration and criminalization of that drug use, now you have all of this trauma. You disconnect people from their families and communities. You saddle them with a criminal record. You make employment really difficult for them when they come out of the criminal justice system with a criminal record. And you have all of this trauma to their family, to themselves, what they experience in the criminal justice system. Now they're trying to get back on their feet. And we know now that trauma is one of the leading risk factors of drug use in the first place, and of that drug use becoming problematic. So I'll tell you a quick story about that. I'm writing a book currently about what it changed my mind and inviting other people to change theirs. And I was interviewing a former narcotics police officer, and he's changed his mind. He advocates now for legal regulation of all drugs. And he said one of the experiences that has stuck with him is a woman that he was using. She didn't know she was being used, but he was using her as an informant to help him learn about the criminal drug industry in their town. And as he got to know her, they became friends. And she told him, you know, when I use heroin, it makes me forget the feeling of my uncle's fingernails when he used to rape me. And he realized, wait, heroin use for her is a very understandable activity. It's helping her to forget these extremely painful experiences of her life. That's not to say everyone who uses heroin has had that experience, but we know that trauma increases exponentially the risk factors for people. So we're actually not helping people to recover from their trauma or helping them to stop using drugs by criminalizing them. We are throwing the gasoline of trauma onto the fire that's already going of their addiction. It's just not helping at all. We should be thinking health, not handcuffs for people who are using drugs.
Health, not handcuffs. I like that a lot, Christina. There's a lot of interesting tidbits that you've been sharing with the audience, so I really appreciate that. I mean, especially what I found striking also in your TED Talk, and people should go check that one out. Just type in Christina Dent into YouTube and you will find her. Is the fact that, like, if people are on the parking lot of a stadium, they just drink beer, they don't consume any they might consume hard liquor, but it's more prevalent to consume like beer. However, once it gets like illegal to bring something into the stadium, then you will do like hard liquor, because the risk of you getting caught is there, but if you bring more alcohol in it, then the reward is higher than just bringing like a bottle of beer in, and you have the same punishment. So that's a very interesting insight, and as an economist, I love those examples. So thank you for bringing that up. And so let's jump real quick from an interesting question we just got from the audience, from a gentleman from, I think, did he say that? Was it from Nigeria? But his name is Prince, and he asks, like, what happens to people who are maybe addicted? So we don't want to lock them up, as you said, Christina, but what role has the government to help them from the addiction? What do you think the role of the government ought to be?
Yeah, so some governments have taken, like what Portugal has done, where they have decriminalized the possession of all drugs. You're not put in jail anymore for possessing drugs. And they have expanded their public health response to drug use. Now it's very easy to get treatment for drug use. They have methadone that's widely available, very easy to access. So they have taken more of a socialized health care approach to that. I'm more of a free market person myself. I prefer smaller government. But I think right now we are using tax dollars, billions and billions of dollars every year on enforcement. If all we did was just shift the way that we're using our tax dollars from enforcement to treatment, we could provide unbelievable treatment for everybody that wanted to access that treatment. So I think we would see a lot less addiction if we stopped criminalizing people. That's what Portugal has seen. Their addiction rate, their problematic drug use rate has dropped by about 30% since they stopped criminalizing people. So we see that's understandable to me when you think about how trauma increases addiction. So when you stop traumatizing people, it makes sense to me that we would see addiction rates fall. And I think we would see that. You're still going to have some problematic use. We still have problematic alcohol use, and alcohol is legal. We handle it through healthcare systems. We try to mitigate the harms to other people. You're not allowed to go beat somebody up just because you're drunk. We're going to arrest you for that. But it's not going to be illegal just for you to be drunk. So we have to hold that tension of there's going to be some harm. It's not better for us to respond in a way that increases harm than to just not respond, in a harmful way. It's not better to just do something than to do, we don't want to do the wrong thing. That's not better.
That's a good point. And it's also interesting to think about like the costs of taking drugs. And if you compare that across different drugs, alcohol and its effect not on the individual, but also on the family, on society, and on the healthcare system is the drug that has the most harm. And there's research being done on that, I think even across countries. So it's an interesting tidbit to think about. So, but it's pretty well known, I think, at this point, and there's a lot of empirical evidence that the war on drugs is very costly. It is highly ineffective. You've said like every 10th American admits that they have taken like an illegal drug within the last couple of months or whatever it might be. So drugs are coming in, drugs are becoming more potent. It's not being prevented right now. People are being incarcerated for non-violent offenses for decades. They cannot be really put back into society without any of the trauma that you've talked about that probably lead to drug use again, and you have this spiral. And all of these costs are very well known and it's empirically out there and there's research on that. But why do you think, you personally, Christina, why many politicians and especially conservatives tend to ignore this abundant evidence?
Yeah, so I think there is abundant evidence, but a lot of people aren't hearing it. So this is kind of how we think about it. We think about people on this issue are either opposed, they're interested, or they're aligned. So I spent most of my life in the opposed category. Meeting Joanne got me interested to learn. And that's when all of a sudden this door of all of this research opened. So it's crucial to understand, if you want to change people's minds on this, that opposed people don't listen to research. Humans are very good at not listening to anything that we don't want to believe. So the crucial step is to help people become interested. And that's when that door opens of being able to actually hear and believe the research that's out there on what's actually happening with the drug war. So I think I would say people's opposition to it generally falls into three categories. And I would say that's either money, misunderstanding, or morals. So I think for me, it was a misunderstanding of where the harm was actually coming from. I simply did not know I didn't take an economics class in college. I did not understand about supply and demand. I mean, I knew generally that principle. I'd never applied it to drugs before. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding, which is why we lay out a very pragmatic approach to what happens when you criminalize a market, what happens when you criminalize a substance, what happens when you criminalize a consumer. Because what we're doing there is we're educating people about why we have the harms that we do, instead of just saying, you should support ending the drug war. Well, for most people who support it, I don't think most people in my experience understand the actual cost of what we're doing and really what's happening and why it's happening. So we try to assume people don't know anything, and we try to take them from square one to 100 in a one evening event that they come to. So some of it's misunderstanding, some of it is money. There's a lot of money being made from drug prohibition. And that's not to say, I don't think most people who are even in that money stream are conscious of the way that it is potentially impacting the way they think. It is just that I read a quote about, if your salary depends on not believing something that's true, you just won't believe that it's true. And I think we have to give people the understanding that if you have an investment in the drug war, and it's so big at this point that a lot of people are touched by it in some way, and their financial world is touched by it in some way, and they're making money in some way off of drug prohibition continuing. I think that is a driver. And then this kind of moral question for a lot of people, they say, I don't care what it's costing us. I just cannot morally support people using substances. I just, the cost is just going to have to be what it is. We have to signal that we don't want people using substances. And I think it's helpful for me. The first time I heard somebody say, adultery, I mean, for me, I'm a Christian, adultery is something we would say that really hurts people. And it's sinful if you're a Christian. That's clear. There's no way that you can do that and not hurt anybody else and not be against the Bible. But we don't put people in jail for adultery. So we already have these categories for things that are morally wrong that we don't put people in jail for. I think most of us have never thought about extending that beyond the category, beyond the things we already put in those categories. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, a person ingesting a substance, how does it help us to actually try to force them not to by destroying their life? It's just not helpful. So I still don't want people using drugs. And that's probably the hardest challenge of my work, is I'm always holding these things in tension. I don't want people using drugs, but my work is working towards a world where they can and not be criminalized for it, where there will be some sort of legal access to substances. And to me, that's not a reason to say we shouldn't do that. I think it's a reason to say there is so much harm happening from drug prohibition that it is worth us working really hard to hold those things in tension, to say we can, just like with smoking, we don't want people smoking, but we're going to allow them to access it. We're going to try to stop them from using it by prevention and treatment, not by fear and terror and destroying their life.
That is very good. And I like that perspective tremendously. And I hope more people will get to that conclusion. But I believe many people don't need to only look at the empirical studies, but they have to have the personal experience like you did, meeting one individual. I vividly remember my interaction once. Like, I was invited to a breakfast by a friend of mine. He started the organization Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship in New York. It does fantastic work also in inner cities, teaching economics and principles of entrepreneurship to youth. But part of his work was also helping people coming out of prison start businesses. And so one of the individuals there I've met, his name was Mike. And Mike and I, we got along very well. We went then to Chinatown just to hang out, and I was just a student. And at some point, like, he told me about how he grew up in the projects, and he showed me, like, he pushed his t-shirt down and he showed me like a bullet wound that he had coming in here, because he was, to use some lingo here, like slinging drugs, because there was like no other way of making money. He wanted to get like new shoes, and his mother couldn't afford it. And it was a single parent home, which is of course very destructive too. And so he was being shot twice before he was 20. And that really showed to me like look, this can happen to anyone. Like if you're growing up in these environments, I mean, nobody wants to do that, but not everybody has like in my case, like the middle class upbringing that I had. And seeing that really changed my mind. Like this one example of Mike was so much stronger than like looking at studies about 10,000 of people. And I think you understand that in your work, and you're bringing the faces to the effects on the war on drugs to people will probably change more and more people's lives than just that evidence. So I really like that's important. So now let me ask you like a more of a tricky question. So would you say that would you be open to legalize all drugs tomorrow? And if not, why not? And if yes, would that be a good idea?
So I think it's definitely a good idea to legalize all drugs. Not because I think that they're not a big deal or they're not harmful or anything like that, but because no substance is made less harmful by criminalizing it. So heroin is very potentially harmful. It's even more harmful when it's on the street and we have no idea what's in the baggie people are buying, and people are getting killed, and people like Mike are in the midst of the crossfire of the market harm from the drug war. I just read an article recently from a mother who just lost her 16-year-old son to a heroin and fentanyl overdose. And she said, my son used to tell me that getting heroin was easier than getting a candy bar. And we got to sit with that, because you and I aren't using heroin. So we think, oh no, there's no heroin here. If we wanted heroin, we would find it easily. It's supply and demand. Everywhere that there is demand, there will always be supply, always. And so we don't have a choice about a world without heroin or a world without cocaine. We have a choice. How are people going to access that? How are we going to handle it in the way that most reduces harm? And I think as much as I absolutely don't want my kids using drugs, as much as I may fear what would happen if they did, it is better for them for those drugs to be behind counters, where they at least have to have an ID to access them, or at least put some form of barrier between them and those drugs. Here's a good example. I interviewed a guy recently who's in recovery from opioid addiction. And he said in high school, him and his friends used to, so he's like 16 at this point, he's underage, obviously. They used to smoke marijuana all afternoon while they went around to different people's houses to try to find someone to buy alcohol for them. So marijuana is illegal. It should be, in our minds, harder for him to access marijuana than alcohol. But it's not. It's the opposite, because a 16-year-old can buy marijuana just as easily as a 46-year-old can. Same people are selling to them. They're breaking the law anyway. They don't care if the person's 46 or 16. It's a customer. When you introduce regulation into it, where you can put an age restriction on it, now suddenly businesses have an incentive not to sell to underage people. It makes it just a little bit harder. Are kids still going to find ways to get the substances that they want? Yes, but we could make it a lot harder for them. And we could make it that the substances that they're accessing, just like with alcohol, even if they get the alcohol, they know what they're drinking. They know what the proof is. And right now, we don't have that with other substances. They're getting heroin on the street. They don't have any idea what's in it. They don't have any idea if it's going to kill them or just get them high. And every time is a risk factor of this could be a lethal dose. The only way to get out of that is to bring those back into regulation again.
I mean, that's a very gutsy stand, because most people would say like, yeah, I'm okay with legalizing like weed and maybe like psilocybin or MDMA, because also it's shown like some benefits for treatments and stuff, but most people don't go all the way until like harder drugs like heroin. So I can see that most people would probably react against that, but you have good arguments why people should still entertain this. But maybe an historical example could also shed some light on that. You've been alluding to alcohol prohibition. And in the United States, before 1914, there was no prohibition of alcohol, and there was no prohibition of any kind of drugs either. What do we know about that time? Did people like run around in the streets and all shooting up heroin because it was available in the streets? Or to tell us a little bit more what the difference was back then.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting story, because I didn't know this. It had never occurred to me that drugs were ever legal that aren't legal now. I mean, I kind of knew that about marijuana, that at one point it had been legal, but I thought heroin and cocaine had always been illegal. I did not realize that actually prohibition is a new invention of trying to prohibit substances and eradicate them from the face of the earth. So Johann Hari, in his book, Chasing the Scream, which I would highly recommend to anyone, it's gripping. It covers this last 100 years of this experiment of drug prohibition and what has happened because of it and options for reform. He goes back to that time to say, what was happening? Did we prohibit heroin and cocaine because they were so harmful to people? And what he found is that no, there was a lot of other reasons for prohibiting them, but it wasn't because they were creating so much chaos in our world. And actually, for people who were addicted to heroin prior to that time, they were allowed to be treated by a doctor. We treated it as a health concern. Doctors were allowed to prescribe heroin to keep their patients on a stable dose of it, to help them taper off of it when they were ready. And what they found is that the vast majority of people who were addicted to heroin were able to continue working. They had jobs, they had families, they could parent, they could be a spouse, they could be a contributing member of society while they were on heroin. Now, we don't have any cultural understanding of that, because the only way that we experience heroin addiction here in the US is problematic, and we associate that with being on the street, stealing things to, continue to feed your addiction. And we don't have any concept that it's actually prohibition that causes all of those harms that we see. The nature of the harm of addiction that we see is largely driven by the way that we handle it, not by the addiction itself. And so for what they used to do is treat drug addiction to what are now illegal drugs as a health issue, and they had much better outcomes. They're trying that again in other places. Canada, Germany, other parts in the UK are doing heroin-assisted treatment, where you can go to a clinic and you can use medical grade pure heroin 3 times a day, and you can be part of their program. You have to use it on site. You can't take it home. And what they found is that when you help people to stabilize their lives, they're not chasing drugs all day. They can go back to having a productive and connected life. And so as you're helping them to fill up their life with good things, many times their heroin use decreases over time, because drug use is always about changing the way that you feel. Well, if you have a life that you want to be fully present for, you need less of a substance that helps you not be fully present in your life. And they have had far better outcomes from this approach. And it makes sense. It makes sense because of what we know about addiction and what we know about what drives addiction. And so that, I think, is what we need to focus more on. I think, going back to your other question, should all drugs be, in the candy aisle? Well, no, marijuana shouldn't be in the candy aisle. We should have it, different regulatory frameworks for different drugs. We have that now. We treat different substances differently based on their potential for harm. We set age restrictions, we've changed that for smoking recently. We can set other kinds of restrictions. Either you have to get a prescription, or you have to get it from a pharmacy, or you have to use it on site like they do at heroin-assisted treatment programs. There's lots of options, and we actually already have those regulatory frameworks available to us that we could use to test out with these other substances. And a lot of other countries are doing that testing already, and we know that it works. We just need to do it.
Very true. And I think one other argument that you made before also speaks to that is if the drugs are in the illegal market, they tend to be much stronger, much more potent. They're stretched with fentanyl and other substances which are so much more harmful, and you don't know what you get. Right now, if you go to a store, you know what alcohol you can get and how much alcohol is in there. If you try to buy any kind of other substance, it might be rat poison in there, or what else is in there that's also very, very harmful. So those are some very good points. I'm getting a question also from another international listener right now. I think he is from Mexico. If you have maybe some thoughts on that. He is asking, why do you think that in some developing countries, specifically in Latin America, where the effects of the war on drugs is so much more pronounced, why are they not trying to address that and maybe legalize it there? What can international organizations or your organization do in order to tackle that issue? So first question, why is it that they don't think about that, even though the harmful effects are much stronger with gangs in the street who have armored vehicles and stuff like that? and what can the international audience or like an NGO like yours can do about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've interviewed a couple of people from Mexico for the book that I'm working on. I've asked them that same question: why hasn't Mexico done this when they're living under so much harm because of prohibition? And a lot of their responses have been that people there have the same misunderstandings that people here do. You know, we could say the same thing about drug prohibition in America. We're losing so many people to overdoses. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. How can we not see what's causing this? But it does take that zooming out, and it's hard for all of us, really, no matter where we are in the world, to actually do that work of zooming out and saying, what's causing this and how could it actually be better? So Mexico is moving in that direction. I was reading this morning about their legislature, their term for it, we call it legislature, rethinking prohibition and ending marijuana prohibition first. So I think that is happening. People are beginning to understand why the harms are happening, what's funding the cartels. And if we can take away that funding, you know, you can only be as violent as you want to be with the amount of money that you need to do it. So if you take away the funding stream for cartels, that's part of their power stream. And so that is a big thing that can happen. I think the same thing for other organizations internationally as we're trying to do here, which is help people change their minds. And what we have found is that even for elected officials who want to change policy, they're terrified to do that because of their fear over what the public will think. Everybody assumes that drug policy is radioactive. You can't talk about it. You can't talk about any of the drug war. It will sink your political career. So the interesting thing is I talk with more and more people in law enforcement, people who make laws, you know, in the legislative process, who have changed their own minds personally, but they won't say so publicly because of fear of what the public will think of them. Then I talk to other people in the public who say, well, I've changed my mind and I think, you know, we should do this, but it's up to the legislature to do anything about it. It's up to our elected officials. I can't do anything about it. So we have lots of people who agree that something different should happen. And everybody is hoping that somebody else is going to take the first step to kind of putting it out there. So we see that as our role as an organization, is helping them to put out their support into the public square. That's a lot of what we do at our events. Most of the time at our events is spent in discussion from the audience. So they are able to get up and give their perspective on the presentation we've just given to them. And we recognize that's really important because people need to hear from people in their own community that they're rethinking this. It makes it part of public discourse instead of something people are afraid to talk about. So the more that we can bring these issues into respectful, non-confrontational public dialogue, the quicker we can move down the path to actually changing policies. But changing minds has to happen before you can change policies. So we focus all of our efforts on helping people change their minds. And we see that as the tipping point that we have to reach in order for those policies to change.
Very good. And your approach regarding the respectful discourse is something that is much more conducive to achieving that end than just saying like, hey, you're evil because you believe in the war on drugs, or hey, you're evil because you're not. And so much of the conversations right now on campus or in Congress is unfortunately on that level, but some good people like you are fighting that out there. Another interesting concept that you've been touching on in regard specifically to developing countries and the war on drugs is an economic concept it's called Bootleggers and Baptists. And it basically, bootleggers are people who used to smuggle alcohol. And Baptists, of course, are religious representatives in their community. And interestingly enough, even though they are normally very much opposed in their opinion, they used to agree on alcohol prohibition. And the same is true with drug lords. They love the war on drugs because it makes it riskier to get those drugs. They can jack up their prices. They are the only providers of this. There's less competition. It's not regulated, and they can use violence. And then you have like some people like politicians who are very much against that, and maybe they convince themselves that it's good for them, but they get also like support from these sorts of violent gangs now. And it's an interesting way of thinking about it, bootleggers and Baptists. But stopping the economic education right now, putting my academic hat to the side, let's jump to the next question. So if you look at the US, if there's like one law that you could snap your finger to get rid of tomorrow and would help millions of Americans, what law would that be and why?
That would be ending marijuana prohibition. So marijuana is by far the most popular illegal substance. More people use marijuana by far than any other illegal substance. So if we're talking about breadth of impact on the number of people that could be impacted by it, it would be ending marijuana prohibition. If you wanted to decrease the number of overdose deaths, nobody's dying from marijuana overdose. That's basically impossible to do. You would have to address our heroin prohibition. But I think a doable step is to end marijuana prohibition. And I think, I was talking with a dad who lost his son to a heroin overdose a couple of years ago. And he said his son used to tell him, "Dad, if I could just have marijuana, I really think I could stop using the heroin." And he would do that. He would be able to stop using it. So you'd say, well, if he's breaking the law to do both, why doesn't he just use the marijuana? Because marijuana, because it was criminalized, would show up in a drug screen. And so it encouraged him to use harder substances that wouldn't show up in a drug screen, so that he could pass the drug test. So if we could end our criminalization of marijuana, people who are addicted to other substances that are more harmful, like heroin, some of them are able to find marijuana as an exit drug to their heroin addiction. And we see that actually borne out in research related to medical marijuana laws. If people who are struggling with a heroin addiction can have access to medical marijuana, some of them are able to stop using heroin. And we've seen a decrease in heroin overdose deaths, or any kind of drug overdose death in states that have a robust medical marijuana program. So far from being the gateway drug to harder things, it is far more often an exit path for people to stop using other substances. And I think we could decrease our overdose death, even if we don't do anything with heroin law. I think we could see a decrease in our drug overdose if we would stop the prohibition and criminalization of marijuana.
That's very interesting. Instead of an entry drug, it could be an exit drug. I don't think that many people talk about that. So it's an excellent point. We have seen a little bit of traction in the United States. I mean, the war on drugs is still very fought, very, very vehemently in this country. I mean, there's some opening up, of course. There's several states who have decriminalized it and sometimes even legalized it. But last year, we have seen some major criminal justice reform being passed. And it was actually a coalition of people from the right wing and the left wing. And some even unlikely bedfellows, because I know that the Koch family was involved on one hand, but then also like some leftist journalists who were fighting against the Kochs before, they came together in order to pass some criminal justice reform. What's your take on that reform? And was it enough?
Yeah, I think it's great that this is a bipartisan issue. I think it's actually one of the uniting issues. It could be one of the uniting issues of our time, in a time that's incredibly divided, because everybody gets more of what they want by ending drug prohibition. If we look at what's actually happening and what we actually get by ending it, whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right or whether you're libertarian, everybody gets more of the values that they hold dearest. No one is winning through drug prohibition, other than, like you said, cartels. They're winning, but nobody else is. So we all get more of what we want. So I love to see bipartisan work on it, because I think it's silly to think that something can only be good for us if we're the only ones that think it's good for us. I mean, nobody wants people speeding down the road at 120 miles an hour. Just because we all agree on that doesn't mean we've somehow given up our values or we're not holding the line for our political beliefs. There are just some policies that are good for everyone. And I see criminal justice reform as being good for everyone. We haven't gone far enough. We still have so many people who are sitting in prison right now for drug crimes that just should not have been crimes at all. We should be taking this out of the criminal justice system. It's the wrong tool for it. I think of using the criminal justice system for drugs as like giving a doctor a hammer and sending them into surgery. So it doesn't matter how well trained that doctor is. It doesn't matter how well he tries to do that surgery. He has the wrong tool. It's not going to turn out well. And we've been doing the same thing with the criminal justice system. We're using the criminal justice system for a complex health issue. It doesn't fit. It's the wrong tool. So we keep getting these terrible outcomes, and we keep wondering why. Why isn't this working? Maybe if we just do more of it. But just like with that doctor with that hammer, he can't do more surgery. He's just got the wrong tool. We need to use the right tool, and we would see far better outcomes from it.
Makes a lot of sense. And looking at right tools, are there a couple of particular countries that you find particularly sound on their approach to drugs? I know you've mentioned Portugal, but in your opinion, which ones are the better countries that are doing good work on this and that the United States could learn from?
Yeah, so I think for us, for a lot of people here, it's difficult for them to look at places in Europe and find a connection point. It just feels very far away, culturally different. So I look at Canada and say, what's Canada doing? They're right next to us. And they legalized marijuana at the national level just a couple of years ago. They have overdose prevention sites there where people can come and use substances that they have bought on the street, but at least they're not going to die because there are people there with naloxone. It's also access to treatment for people to come, and we see that those are positive health outcomes. They help people stay alive long enough to get treatment, and it helps people get into treatment. They have heroin-assisted treatment programs where they allow people who have not been able to become sober through other treatment to access medical grade heroin under the care of a doctor, and have found very positive outcomes from that again. So they, to me, are trying all of the things that we know work. Part of the reason we know they work is because they've done them for a long time and have shown that they work. And now we just need to bring those over the border and around the world.
Very good. That makes sense. And another point that we have not been talking about, but it's interesting, is also to think about not only reducing the harm generally in society, but also the opportunities. Because right now we know that MDMA or ecstasy is in phase 3 trials with the FDA, and it can really help tremendously people with PTSD. And again, it's like the example, like you would probably never put a drug in your body, Christina, and I thoroughly respect that, and I don't want to do that either. But I've met people who had a lot of trauma and mental stress, who have been sometimes self-medicating, but also sometimes being part of these trials, whose life has been changed and who have been alleviating, and who could have looked in a different way on these trauma, where they had to see like people around them die, or they've been raped or something along those lines. So there is a lot of opportunity for that as well. And we see this, the FDA is exploring that, and psilocybin, but it comes along very slow since it has been forbidden a long time ago. So in your opinion, we have many people here listening to us and listening to you and your great advice that you have to say, but it seems like overwhelming. It's a complicated issue. And the question is like, what can maybe the individual do? What can I do to make change on this? So in your opinion, what is the most effective way that somebody here in the audience can take action today and bring about change in their community?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is so I love to talk to people about why drug prohibition is not working. My second favorite thing to talk about is with other advocates about how to communicate your passion for this issue in a way that helps people engage instead of pushes them away. So the first time that anybody asked me about ending drug prohibition, this was how the conversation went. So what do you think about legalizing drugs? I could not even speak. My heart rate went through the roof. This is before I met Joanne. I was so angry. I left the room. I could not engage at all. I didn't even know anybody thought that. I didn't even know that was a position that people had, that drugs should be legalized. My mind went into a blank slate, other than I just know I'm really mad about this. So that's point number one on how not to start a conversation. I didn't even know what that meant. So I was lacking that education piece. I was still in that misunderstanding category of, I don't even know what that means, or what are they even talking about? What I heard is, do you think drugs should be celebrated? And do you think drug addiction is no big deal? Well, that's not what they meant, but that's what I heard, because I didn't have any other education about what's actually happening. So I love Adam Hammis has written a book. It's a lot about how to engage with people who are on a difficult issue. And he says, facts delivered poorly are facts to very few people. That's true. It is true. Our delivery of what we are passionate about matters absolutely as much as what you're actually passionate about. So when I think about helping people change their minds, which is the first step to changing policy, if we think about, okay, the research is out there for those people that are interested, but how do we move more people from opposed to interested so they'll actually listen to all this great research that we have? I think about it in 3 things to avoid and 3 things to embrace. So this is what I would say. Most people need a lot of small touches over time, offered with respect by somebody that they trust. So these are kind of 4 pillars of what we say that the process of people changing their mind. A lot of small touches over time with respect from someone that they trust. Now, 3 things that you don't want to do if you're trying to actually help people move forward on this issue. The number 1 thing is not to turn people off. The people are looking for reasons to stop listening to anything that is challenging something that they already believe. Don't give them reasons to stop listening. It is not righteous to turn somebody off, to be so bold and forceful that they just stop talking. We have developed this idea that somehow we've really made a difference if we've really taken a tough stand. You can feel righteous if you want, but I want to actually change policy and change the world. And that means that we have to meet people where they are, and we want them to engage. We don't want to turn them off. So don't turn people off. That's number 1, what not to do. The second is, don't expect people to make a quantum leap all at one time. People don't do that. People change their minds over time. And that's really frustrating for those of us that see the harm that's happening with drug prohibition, and we want to see it change tomorrow. But the reality is that to expect someone to go from supporting one thing, having a 30-minute conversation with you, and going and supporting a completely different thing, to me, it's disrespectful of the human intellect. Like, we don't do that ourselves. We think about things. We ponder how it fits into all of our other commitments that we already have ideologically. We wrestle through all of our questions. We need to give people the opportunity to do that. Help them take 1 step. That's great. 1 step is great. That's the way that they get to be able to take the next step and the next step. Don't expect that quantum leap or try to get people to take a quantum leap. And the third thing not to do is don't mix issues. So if you want to convince somebody to become a Democrat or a libertarian, don't mix drug policy in with all those other things you're also trying to get them to change their minds on. People changing their minds on 1 thing is really hard. Don't try to get them to change their mind on 15 things all at one time. The 3 things that you can do that are extremely helpful. So this is proactive things that you can do to engage people. The first is to be a calm listener. People want their concerns to be addressed. And the only way that you're going to know what their concerns are is if you ask them and if you listen to them. So you projecting what you think their problems with legalization are doesn't help move the conversation forward. You need to be a calm listener. The second is to be respectful. Help people connect to the human cost of prohibition, but don't do that in a way that turns people off. We all want to be respected. We all want to be listened to. In the same way that I don't want people who use drugs to be shamed and blamed and treated like they're subhuman, I think it's wrong for me to turn around and use shame and blame and treat people as subhuman who disagree with me. That's just using all of those harmful techniques on a different group of people. That doesn't move us forward. And the third thing is to be invitational. Changing our minds is a really, really vulnerable endeavor. To consider if you've been wrong there's a reason we don't do it very often. It feels scary. It feels uncertain. It feels like we're kind of walking through a mist and we're not sure where we're going to end up. Recognize that and value that if people are on the journey at all, it's a really vulnerable endeavor for them, and we need to honor that in them and help them to feel safe. How can we give them safety while they're walking down that journey? How can we not be judgmental? How can we not be argumentative? How can we not be confrontational? Because again, when they're on that journey of, oh my goodness, could I possibly be wrong about this? The worst thing that we can do is to come at them with swords and spears. What that does is turns them off, and they say, see, that's why I'm not part of this, because perfect. I have my excuse now why I can shut that door. I can move back to my opposed category, and I can let that go. And that's what we don't want. I tell people, think about your work if you want to move people on issues as a bridge builder. You're not a soldier. If you want to move them, now you might feel like you're a soldier, you might have the passion of a soldier, but to actually help people move with you, you need to be a bridge builder. That means going to them, meeting them where they are, building bridges to reach them. You can't expect people who don't agree with you to build their own bridges to meet you. That would be nice, but people don't do that. It's my job to build bridges to the people I want to reach and to help them to engage. So Adam Hammis, in that same book, he says, give up on being right in exchange for progress. And I think about that as, it's not worth being right if we can't change the world. We want to be right and change the world, which means we have to give up on winning every argument, and we have to focus on the bigger goal of changing the world. And how we do that is helping people to engage. We do that through respect and invitation and being good listeners and not turning people off. And that, I think, is what's going to bring us into a place where drug prohibition ends. I'll tell you a quick story about how that happened. So we had about 2 years ago, we did a book giveaway. This is before we had nonprofit status. And we gave it away to a man who is a generational Mississippian, evangelical Christian, been involved in conservative policy and advocacy here for many, many years, and was very much opposed to ending drug prohibition. But he took the book through the giveaway, and we didn't hear anything else from him for about 18 months. Then he came to one of our events that we did in his town. And he said, we go around the room and everybody kind of gives their, what's your initial thoughts? And he said, for me, thinking about changing my mind on this, like, it really does feel like an earthquake. Like, this just feels just earth shattering, to give up, to move on this issue, to give up the drug war that I've supported for all these years. But I want to know if it's right. And so I'm trying to engage, I'm trying to listen and learn. So over the course of the evening, somebody said, well, I think we just need to decriminalize drug use and not legalize substances. And he said, well, if you do that, though, you don't get rid of all the crime that's associated with the market. So it seems like to get the biggest impact, we actually need to legalize substances. And so I could see his mind, he's working through this. He's interested. He's moved from opposed. He's interested. And then the next day he sent a text saying, how do we get this done? So he, over the course of 2 years, and it took me 2 years to change my mind of active learning, moved from opposed to interested to aligned. We gave him opportunities to learn. We didn't say sign on the dotted line today, but he changed his mind. And the more people that we can help to take that journey is how we change policy and change the world on drug policy.
Fantastic. And we as an organization, we train every year 3,000, 4,000 students all around the world. And we try to instill the very principles that you've been sharing with us in the last statements. So the 3 things that you should be avoid doing and the 3 things that you should be doing. And that's fantastic. So maybe we cut the segment out and just give that as part of our training as well to our students, because it is so important. It's such a hard lesson to learn, because it's very easy to take like your book of your favorite thinker and like slap other people over the head. And it's very hard to like really engage with arguments that are wrong and that and just say like, no, you are not thinking it correctly, and you're saying like things that you push away them from the very ideas that you love and cherish. So it starts with us to become better communicators and overcome some of the challenges that we might have. Maybe we are too impatient within a conversation. Maybe we are not like as humble as we should be. So that journey will take a lifetime, but that is the work that needs to get done, because if we're not able to change anyone's mind, then like, what are we doing? Like, if we are just like pushing people away and we are being offensive and demeaning, we might have won the argument because we had the better empirical data or the better logical argument, but you probably have made an enemy. You've probably made like somebody that you have offended then, and you have not pushed anything in the right direction. And that lesson is hard to learn, and especially for our young people. But last year, our students have organized an incredible 2007 events with over 120,000 people around the world.
Wow.
And I like to think that most of our students, if not all, taking these lessons that you have shared with us to heart and spread good ideas around the world in a loving and kind and appreciative way. And that's what you're doing with your nonprofit. So before we're wrapping up here, tell us a little bit more about how can people find more about your work, how they can become involved, and yeah, shoot.
Yeah. Fantastic. So you can find us at enditforgood.com. If you want to know kind of how to get started, just go to enditforgood.com/get started. If you want to become part of our advocacy group, you can go to enditforgood.com/2 minutes. There is an advocacy email that we send out once a week. It takes 2 minutes or less to be involved in just moving this conversation forward a little at a time. You can find me on social media at Christina B. Dent, and you can find all of End It for Good's work at End It for Good MS across social media platforms. I would love to connect with you. You can email me, Christina at enditforgood.com. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, if you have concerns, if you have ideas. This is what I do. I dialogue with people, whether it's people helping them change their minds or people that want to better communicate their passion with more people. I would love to connect and hear your thoughts. So yeah, come find us. I'll tell you, Joanne's doing great today. From my story, people always ask, what happened with Joanne? She's doing great. She's been sober since her son was born, and almost will be 5 years sober this fall. And she's doing great. She works now full-time in treatment with helping other people find sobriety. It doesn't always happen that way, but it did for her. And she's not in prison. She's raising her son, and they're doing well. So there's a lot to be gained, and I hope that's inspiring for all of your students and others who are working on these issues, that it affects the lives of real people. There's real people who stand to gain from us rethinking our criminalization of drugs and people who use them, and it's worth putting time and effort into. I think it will actually really benefit the world, and that's what I want to be part of with my life too.
An amazing and beautiful conclusion to a fantastic conversation. Christina, thank you so much for taking the time and talking to our audience. And keep doing what you're doing, and we will be part of your journey. And please let us know how we can help your efforts as well. So thanks again so much for taking the time, and have a wonderful Labor Day weekend for the folks here in the United States, and everyone else have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Wolf. I appreciate it.